The desert night had a silence that pressed against the skin, broken only by the whistle of the wind brushing across, the dry brush and the occasional cry of a lone coyote in the distance. The cowboy rode slow, his horse tired from the day's long march, the saddle creaking under his weight as he scanned the horizon. He had planned to make it to town before sundown, but fate often laughed at men who thought they could command the wild. The moon hung low, throwing silver light across the barren sand, and it was there, half buried in dust near a patch of mesquite, that he saw movement. At first he thought it a trick of shadows, some desert animal crawling weakly in the night, but as he drew closer, the outline became clear, small, fragile, and human. He dismounted and knelt, his hand brushing the boy's shoulder, and felt the tremor of life still clinging inside him. The child was young, no more than 10, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt, and a shallow cut across his side where blood had dried dark, eyes half open, yet filled with fire. The boy looked at him not with fear, but with defiance, the kind of stare that told the cowboy this was no ordinary lost soul. He hesitated, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a heavy rope. Helping this child meant crossing a line most men on the frontier never dared to cross. The scars of conflict between settlers and tribes were fresh, and blood had stained the soil too many times to count. Yet leaving the boy there meant certain death before dawn. With a slow breath, he lifted the child into his arms, feeling the frail weight of him against his chest, and carried him back to the barn that stood behind his small homestead. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of hay and old wood, the lantern casting long shadows as he laid the boy down on a pile of blankets. He fetched water, cleaned the wound, and muttered words of reassurance, though he doubted the child understood. The boy's eyes never left his, sharp and searching, as if trying to read the man's soul in that flickering light. Through the long hours of night, the cowboy sat watch, his rifle across his lap, listening to the distant cries of wolves and the whispers of his own conscience. And when the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, he stepped outside to breathe the cool, morning air, only to feel the earth beneath his boots tremble with the thunder of hooves. He looked up, and his heart froze. Across the wide desert plain, stretching farther than his eyes could measure, 200 warriors on horseback had gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on him and the boy he had saved. The cowboy stood still on the porch, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe of the barn, eyes locked on the horizon where the line of horsemen seemed to stretch endlessly. The morning sun had only just risen, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, but the sight before him turned the warmth into ice that sank deep into his chest. 200 warriors sat astride their horses, silent as stone, their faces unreadable, their long hair catching the light like dark fire. Their ponies pawed the ground impatiently, the sound of snorts and stamping hooves carrying on the wind. The cowboy felt the familiar tightening in his stomach, the old instinct that warned of danger before a man even reached for his weapon. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let the scene settle into him like a brand burned onto leather. Behind him, he heard the rustle of blankets as the boy stirred, and soon the small figure stepped into the light, blinking against the morning glare. The child looked past him at the warriors, his lips pressing together in a line that spoke both of recognition and fear. The cowboy's hand dropped to the boy's shoulder, firm but not harsh, an anchor to keep him steady. "Easy now," he muttered under his breath, though whether he spoke to the boy or to himself, he couldn't quite say. The air between the porch and the warriors felt like a taut rope, stretched so thin it might snap with the slightest touch. He knew they hadn't come by chance. Someone had seen, someone had followed, and now the boy's people had come to claim what was theirs. The question was whether they had come for blood or for peace. Slowly, the cowboy lifted his hat from his head, a gesture of respect that cost him nothing but might mean everything. He felt the boy stiffen beneath his touch, torn between relief and dread, but the cowboy kept his stance steady, his eyes never leaving the riders. They had the numbers, the power, and every reason to despise him, but he had one thing. They did not expect the choice. He made the night before to protect rather than abandon. The morning wind carried dust between them, swirls of sand rising like spirits in the light, and in that breathless silence, the cowboy understood that the next words spoken or the next step taken could decide whether this place became a graveyard or a place of truce. He waited, calm on the surface, though inside his heartbeat pounded like the hooves that shook the earth. The standoff stretched long enough for the sun to climb higher, spilling light across the desert and sharpening every line of the moment until it felt carved into stone. The cowboy's throat was dry, yet he dared not shift or lick his lips, for any sudden movement might be mistaken for provocation. He could see the glint of steel tips where arrows rested against bowstrings, the long lances tipped with feathers swaying in the morning breeze, and the stern faces of the men who sat atop their restless horses, their eyes like sharpened blades fixed upon him. Memories surged unbidden years back, riding with men who had fired shots into villages, the cries of women and children echoing through smoke, the shame that never left him. He had turned his back on that life, but scars of the past had ways of finding a man again, and now they stood before him in flesh and blood. The boy by his side remained still, though his small hand trembled against the cowboy's leg, and the man pressed his palm gently on the child's shoulder, steadying him. The silence finally broke when a figure detached itself from the line of warriors. A tall man with painted face and eagle feathers in his hair urged his horse forward, moving with a calm authority that commanded respect. The cowboy knew at once this was no ordinary rider but the leader of the band, a chief whose very presence carried the weight of generations. The chief rode closer, halting just far enough to show caution yet near enough that the cowboy could see the stern lines etched across his weathered face. For a long moment neither spoke, the air thick with the weight of unspoken history. Then the chief's voice rang out, deep and measured, carrying easily across the space between them. The words were in his own tongue, but the meaning was clear to the cowboy's ears. A question: why is the child with you? Why has a man of your kind laid hands upon one of ours? The cowboy drew a slow breath, tipping his head respectfully, and though he knew his words might not be understood, he let them fall plain and honest. I found him hurt, he said, his voice steady though his heart thundered. I gave him shelter, that's all. The boy looked up at him, then at the warriors, his lips parting as if to speak, but no sound leaving him yet. The chief's eyes narrowed, as though weighing truth against lies, weighing honor against history. Behind him, 200 men sat silent, waiting on his judgment. The cowboy knew in that instant that his life, and perhaps the child's too, hung by the thinnest thread, a thread woven from trust, mercy, and choices made when no one was watching. The chief's silence pressed harder than any war cry, his piercing eyes never leaving the cowboy's face, and in that stillness the desert itself seemed to wait. The cowboy could hear the horses breathing, could see the flicker of impatience in the warriors' hands gripping their weapons, could feel the boy's heart racing beneath his palm. He knew well that in moments like this, words mattered less than intent, and yet intent was the hardest thing to prove. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward off the porch, leaving his rifle leaning against the wall behind him, both hands raised to show he carried no threat. The boy made a small sound of protest, but the cowboy hushed him with a steady glance. One wrong move would unleash a storm that no man could stop. Dust swirled around his boots as he approached, each step echoing louder than thunder in his own ears. And when he came to a halt halfway between the barn and the line of warriors, he stood tall but humble, letting the morning light show the lines of wear on his face. He had seen too much blood, too much fire, and though he carried no badge, number flag, no symbol of allegiance, he bore something stronger: the choice to protect a child not his own. The chief shifted slightly in his saddle, then spoke again, this time in halting English, the words rough but clear. Why? A single word, but heavy as a mountain. The cowboy's mouth went dry, yet his answer came without hesitation. Because he needed help, he said, his voice cutting through the desert air like the ring of iron on stone. Because I couldn't walk away, the warriors murmured faintly, a ripple of sound like wind moving through tall grass, their eyes darting between their leader and the stranger who dared stand before them with nothing but honesty. The boy, gathering courage, stepped forward too, his small hand gripping the cowboy's arm as though to anchor himself. His voice, though shaky, carried to the men across the plain. He spoke in his people's tongue, quick words filled with urgency, his eyes flashing with something more than fear, something close to loyalty. Though the cowboy didn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. The boy was telling them what had happened, telling them that this man had chosen to save him rather than leave him to die. The chief's stern gaze softened only a fraction, but it was enough to shift the air. He studied the boy, then the cowboy, then the empty rifle left leaning by the barn. Still, the tension did not vanish. Every bow remained drawn, every hand remained tight upon its weapon. This was no ending, only the edge of a beginning, and the cowboy knew the hours ahead would decide whether dawn gave way to peace or to bloodshed. The wind picked up as if the desert itself wished to break the silence that bound them, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and dust, rattling through the sparse brush like the whisper of restless spirits. The cowboy stood unflinching, though his body felt heavy with the weight of every eye upon him. Hundreds of stares sharp as arrowheads pressing into his skin. The boy's words still hung in the air, and though the cowboy did not know their meaning, he sensed their truth, sensed the shift that had rippled through the line of warriors like a stone dropped into still water. Yet the chief had not yet made his judgment, and until he did, life or death balanced on the knife's edge. The cowboy lowered his hands slowly, cautiously, until they rested at his sides, a gesture of calm rather than defiance, then looked the chief in the eye with a steadiness that spoke louder than any tongue. "If you take him," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I will not stop you. But know this: he was hurt, and I gave him shelter. That's all I did." The boy tightened his grip on the man's arm, his face pale but determined, and then to the cowboy's surprise, he stepped in front of him, as though shielding the man who had shielded him. His small frame looked fragile against the line of mounted warriors, yet the bravery in his stance was enough to stir even the most hardened heart. The chief's expression shifted, not softened entirely, but touched by something deeper: recognition. Perhaps that honor could be found even in unlikely places. He turned his head slightly, scanning the silent ranks behind him, and for a heartbeat the desert seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a single raised hand, he gave a signal. The archers lowered their bows. The tension cracked like ice beneath the spring sun, not gone but eased, and the cowboy felt his lungs fill fully for the first time since dawn. Still, he did not relax, for he knew this was no ending, only a pause. The chief spoke again, words half in his tongue, half in English, each syllable deliberate. "We will speak tomorrow." With that, he wheeled his horse around, and like a tide obeying the moon, the 200 warriors turned as one, their horses kicking up a storm of dust as they rode back across the plain. The boy watched them go, his shoulders sagging with relief, while the cowboy simply stood, staring at the horizon long after they had disappeared from sight. He knew what tomorrow meant. It meant judgment, it meant trial, it meant facing not just a chief but the weight of history itself. As the sun climbed higher and the barn cast long shadows across the sand, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and sure. "Rest now," he said quietly, his voice carrying both promise and warning. "Tomorrow we'll need all the strength we can get." The boy nodded, and for the first time since the night before, the cowboy allowed himself a breath of hope. Yet deep inside, he knew the storm was only gathering.